After the funeral, everything seemed to change. The house that once felt like home, a place filled with laughter, warmth, and the scent of freshly baked cookies, suddenly felt like a cold, empty shell. As the final goodbye was said, and the last bit of grief was whispered into the wind, one boy stood in the doorway, holding onto his mother's memory like a lifeline. But his relatives had other plans. The death of his mother had left him with a shattered world, and no one seemed willing to pick up the pieces. They came in, one by one, cousins, aunts, uncles, all of them polite, but there was something in their eyes, something that didn't belong. They couldn't wait for the formalities to end so they could get back to their own lives, to the things they truly cared about. He could see it, their cold, calculated glances, the way they quickly started taking down pictures from the walls, their voices low but pointed as they discussed who'd get what. He was just a boy minus 12 years old, but even he could feel a tension in the room, the unspoken agreement between the adults that he was no longer part of the equation. "Where will I stay?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. No one had an answer. His uncle, who'd always been kind to him, looked away, shifting uncomfortably. His aunt, with her sharp features and a coldness in her voice, offered a quick solution. "It's best if you move out, now that your mother's gone." The words hit him like a slap, but he didn't have the strength to argue. He was still too numb, still too broken from the loss to fully understand what was happening. They took his mother's house. They took everything. And in the space of just a few days, they took his sense of belonging too. Years passed. The boy grew into a teenager, each day feeling like an eternity. His new home, if you could even call it that, was with a distant relative who treated him more like an inconvenience than family. He learned to keep his head down, to blend in, to stay out of their way. The pain of being abandoned, of losing everything he had ever known, never fully left him, but he buried it deep. There was no place for weakness in this new life. There was no room for grief. But deep down, something inside him started to change. The boy who had been left behind began to wonder, what if he could get back what was taken from him? What if he could find a way to reclaim the life that was stripped away, piece by piece, at his mother's funeral? Years later, that day finally came. He stood on the threshold of the old house, the place where everything had fallen apart, the place where his life had been torn from him. The house stood as it always had, only now it felt different. The paint was peeling, the windows cracked, but it was still the house where he had spent his childhood, the place where his mother had loved him, and where they had built a life together. As he stood there, his heart pounded. He was about to confront the family members who had cast him aside, the ones who had taken everything from him, to find out what had really happened after he was gone. And what he discovered was nothing like what he expected. What had they been hiding? And why had they treated him like a stranger when he was family? The answers were buried in the walls of that house, and now, after all these years, he was ready to find them. But would the truth bring him peace, or would it break him once and for all? This is where the story truly begins. As he stepped closer to the old house, a wave of memories crashed over him. He remembered his mother's laughter echoing through the walls, the smell of her perfume lingering in the hallway, the way she used to hum as she cooked dinner. But all of that was gone now. Everything he had known had slipped through his fingers, and what was left seemed to mock him. The peeling paint, the broken window shutters, it all felt like a reflection of his life now, decaying, forgotten, and left to wither away. The boy, now a young man, took a deep breath. The weight of years of pain and confusion pressed heavily on his chest. He didn't know what he was hoping for as he stood there, staring at the house. But the need to know the truth, to understand what had really happened after his mother died, was too strong to ignore. They had all moved on. His relatives, those people who should have been his family, had simply discarded him. The people he had trusted most in the world had become strangers in a blink of an eye. And for years, the boy had told himself that it didn't matter, that he had survived, that he had found a way to carry on without them. But now, as he stood before the house, all the unanswered questions began to surface, demanding answers. He wasn't sure where to start, so he pushed open the front door. It creaked, just as it had when he was a child. The house smelled faintly of dust and disuse. He stepped inside, his footfalls echoing through the empty halls. It was eerily quiet. The furniture had been replaced, the walls stripped of any trace of his mother. There was nothing left to remind him of the life he had once lived. He made his way to the living room, where he had spent so many nights as a child, curled up on the couch with his mom, watching old movies together. His heart ached as he ran his fingers along the dusty mantel, and that's when he saw it, a small, faded photo frame tucked behind a stack of books. The photo was of him, his mother, and his relatives, taken at a family gathering before things started to fall apart. The image felt distant, like a dream he could barely remember. But there was one face that stood out, his uncle. The same uncle who had seemed so kind, who had promised to look after him after his mother's passing. The same uncle who had been there when everything fell apart. A shiver ran down his spine. What had happened to him? The boy turned the photo over, hoping for some kind of clue, some indication of the truth. But there was nothing written on the back, just the photo, and the lingering feeling that something was terribly wrong. His mind raced. Why had his relatives abandoned him? Why had they pushed him out when his mother was gone? And what was his uncle's role in all of it? He had always trusted him. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that something about his uncle's actions had never quite sat right. There had been little things, small moments where he seemed to act in ways that didn't align with the image of a caring guardian. It wasn't until later, when the boy had grown older, that he began to understand. The subtle shifts in behavior, the way his uncle avoided certain topics, the way he was never around when it mattered most. He had started to piece things together, but the truth still eluded him. The more he dug into the past, the more he realized that the family he thought he knew had been hiding something. He had heard whispers of financial struggles, of secrets and debts that no one had ever spoken about. And there was one name that kept coming up in the hushed conversations he overheard, his mother's. The boy had never fully understood what it meant, but he had a gut feeling that his mother's death was tied to more than just her passing. There was something darker at play, something that his relatives were desperately trying to keep buried. Days turned into weeks as he searched the house for any sign of the truth. He opened drawers, searched through old boxes, even rifled through his mother's old journals. But every time he thought he was getting closer to the answers, something held him back. There were no smoking guns, no undeniable evidence, just more questions. His anger started to grow, but so did his resolve. He was going to find out what had really happened, no matter what it took. And then one evening, as he was rummaging through the attic, he found something that made his blood run cold. A letter. It was addressed to his mother, but it wasn't from anyone he recognized. He tore open the envelope, his hands trembling as he pulled out the letter. It was short, written in a hurried scrawl. "I know what you're planning. If you don't follow through, I will make sure everything falls apart. You won't get away with it. Not this time." The boy's heart raced as he read the letter again. The words didn't make sense. What was his mother planning? Who was threatening her? And why had he never heard of this before? His thoughts were interrupted by a sound downstairs, a door creaking open. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. Was someone in the house? Slowly, he moved toward the stairs, his pulse pounding in his ears. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The door slammed shut, and then silence. The boy's instincts told him he wasn't alone. He had to know what was going on. He had to confront his relatives, get to the bottom of this before it was too late. But as he reached the top of the stairs, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. The boy's heart skipped a beat as he stood frozen at the top of the stairs, watching his uncle move quietly across the hall. There was a heaviness to the air, a feeling of dread that clung to every corner of the house. The young man's instincts screamed at him to stay hidden, to not confront the man who had been both a protector and a stranger. But his need for answers outweighed the fear gnawing at him. He took a slow, calculated step forward, peering around the corner just enough to see his uncle whispering to another figure. The other person was familiar, yet unrecognizable. It was one of the relatives who had been a part of his mother's life. An aunt, he thought. But something was different. Her eyes were wild, desperate, like a woman who had lost all sense of control. The conversation was low, but every word seemed to send shockwaves through him. He heard snippets, fragments of a plan, his mother's inheritance, debts, secrets, and something even darker. His mother had been involved in something dangerous, something his uncle and other relatives had tried to cover up. But it wasn't just money. No, it was much more than that. They were talking about something far more sinister, something that had to do with his mother's death. He had been right all along. His uncle wasn't the man he had thought he was. He wasn't a kind-hearted guardian, simply stepping in to fill the void after his mother's passing. No, his uncle had been playing a game, one that had cost the boy his home, his family, and his peace of mind. The house wasn't just a home. It was a key to something bigger, something that had been buried for years. His uncle suddenly turned, and for a brief moment their eyes met. The boy's blood ran cold. There was no denying it now. His uncle knew he had been watching. And just like that, the illusion was shattered. The uncle's warm facade cracked, revealing a man driven by greed and fear. "You shouldn't have come here." His uncle's voice was cold, but there was a tremor in it that hinted at something more. "This was never meant for you. It was always for us." His aunt stepped forward, her expression twisted into something unrecognizable. "Your mother was the last one standing between us and what we wanted, and now you're just a complication." The boy's mind reeled. His mother had been trying to protect him, protect all of them. She had known something about the family's dark past, something they had been willing to kill for. But when the boy's mother had started to gather information, to try to expose what was really happening behind closed doors, they had taken action. They had silenced her, just as they had planned to silence him if he got too close to the truth. As the realization hit him, something inside him snapped. The anger that had been bubbling inside for years, the betrayal, the confusion, it all came rushing to the surface. He wasn't just fighting for answers anymore. He was fighting for his mother's legacy, for the truth she had died trying to protect. He had to make them face what they had done. "You can't run from this," the boy said, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and determination. "I will make sure the world knows what you did, what you've been hiding." His uncle's face twisted in a mocking smile. "You think you can change anything? The game is over. You're too late." But just as the words left his uncle's lips, the sound of sirens blared in the distance, growing louder by the second. The boy's heart raced. He had called the authorities earlier, after piecing together enough of the puzzle to know what was about to unfold. The time for running was over. In that moment, everything seemed to happen at once. His aunt lunged toward him, but the boy was faster, knocking the old woman back with a force he hadn't known he was capable of. He turned to face his uncle one last time. The man who had promised to look after him, the man who had made him believe in family, was nothing more than a liar and a thief. The police arrived in a flurry of movement, quickly apprehending his uncle and aunt. The boy stood in the background, still trying to process everything that had happened. His mind felt like it was spinning. It was over. It had all been over before it had even begun. Days later, after the dust settled, the boy stood in front of the house one last time. It no longer felt like home, but it no longer felt like a prison either. His mother's legacy had been uncovered, and the truth had come to light. He had spent years fighting for answers, for closure, for peace, and now finally he had it. The weight that had been crushing him for so long was gone, replaced with a sense of freedom he had never known before. He thought about his mother, about how proud she would have been to see him stand tall in the face of everything. She had loved him, protected him, even from beyond the grave. And though she was gone, she had never truly left him. Her strength, her love, her courage, it was all a part of him now. As he turned to leave the house behind for good, the boy realized that he had found something far more important than answers. He had found his own strength. The journey had been long, painful, and full of betrayal, but had led him to a place of healing, and that was worth more than anything. With one last look at the house, he stepped forward, ready to start a new chapter. A chapter where the past no longer defined him. A chapter where he would take control of his own story. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was truly free. A shadow moved across the hall, and a figure emerged from the darkness.